4 Colombians came chasing fortune. One ended up in black bags. The others vanished. Was it the cartel? The cops? Or something darker? You think you know paradise? Think again. The humid air of Cancun hung heavy, thick with the scent of salt and blooming jasmine, a deceptive sweetness that masked the city's undercurrents. For Marco, the turquoise waters and the promise of sun-drenched prosperity had been a siren song, pulling him away from the familiar gray of Bogotá. He envisioned a life where hustle translated directly to abundance, a stark contrast to the endless grind back home. Isabella, fiery and fiercely independent, saw Cancun as a blank canvas, a place where her ambition wouldn't be stifled by tradition. The whispers of gota, a system of lending that seemed to bypass the slow, bureaucratic arteries of conventional finance, painted a picture of immediate returns, a shortcut to the life she craved. Javier, quiet and watchful, was driven by a more urgent need. Debts back home loomed like storm clouds, and the allure of quick cash in a booming tourist town felt like a lifeline. He wasn't blind to the risks, the hushed warnings he'd heard, but desperation had a way of meeting caution. Luis, the youngest of the 4, was simply chasing a dream of adventure, a taste of the exotic. The stories Marco had shared, of easy earnings and a vibrant nightlife, had ignited a youthful yearning for something more exciting than their quiet Andean town could offer. He saw that gota as a thrilling, if slightly edgy, opportunity to fund his newfound freedom. They arrived in staggered waves, each carrying their own baggage of hope and unspoken anxieties. Cancun greeted them with a dazzling smile of white sand beaches and pulsating energy, but beneath the surface, shadows stirred. The relentless pursuit of wealth had carved out a darker side to this paradise, a landscape where desperation could be easily exploited, and where the lines between opportunity and danger blurred with the setting sun. The whispers of easy money carried an unspoken echo, a hint of the price that might have to be paid. Their paths, drawn together by this alluring promise, were unknowingly leading them into a labyrinth where escape might prove impossible. The vibrant hues of Cancun, they would soon discover, could just as easily bleed into something far more sinister. And the easy fortune they sought? It might just cost them everything. But that realization was a shadow yet to fully fall. But the shimmering facade of Cancun concealed a darker reality, one where the pursuit of fortune often intersected with dangerous undercurrents and ruthless individuals. For Marco, Isabella, Javier, and Luis, this hidden world would soon reveal its menacing face as they delved deeper into the intricacies of their newfound venture. Their introduction to the gota system was orchestrated by a man named Rafael. He possessed a disarming smile and a practiced air of camaraderie, instantly putting the newcomers at ease. Rafael spoke of the drop-by-drop method with a casual confidence, painting it as a simple exchange, small, manageable loans offered to those outside the traditional banking system, repaid daily with a modest interest. He presented himself not just as a guide but as a mentor, someone who had navigated these waters successfully and was now extending a hand to fellow Colombians seeking a better life in this foreign land. The initial days felt deceptively straightforward. Rafael provided them with lists of contacts, small business owners, market vendors, individuals needing a quick infusion of cash. The amounts let were small, almost trivial, ranging from a few hundred to a couple of thousand pesos. The daily collection rounds became their routine, a rhythmic tapping on doors, a brief exchange of cash and pleasantries, a tally mark in their ledger. There was a certain thrill in the immediate turnover, the tangible evidence of their earnings accumulating day by day. Marco, with his easy charm, often found himself engaging in friendly banter with the borrowers, building a rapport that seemed beneficial. Isabella, ever the pragmatist, meticulously tracked their accounts, her sharp mind ensuring every peso was accounted for. Javier, initially hesitant, found a quiet satisfaction in the steady income, a balm to the financial anxieties that had driven him to Cancun. And Luis, energized by the novelty of it all, navigated the bustling city with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. However, beneath the surface of this seemingly simple enterprise, subtle cracks began to appear. The clientele, while initially appearing as everyday individuals, often carried an air of desperation or lived in the city's less polished corners. There were hushed tones, averted gazes, and promises that sometimes stretched into the next day, then the day after. Rafael would brush off these minor delays with a dismissive wave of his hand, attributing them to the transient nature of Cancun's economy. Mañana, tranquilo, he'd say with a knowing smile, but a flicker of something unreadable would sometimes cross his eyes. Coercive tactics, though not explicitly taught, were subtly implied. A raised eyebrow, a slightly firmer tone, a pointed reminder of the agreed-upon terms, these were the tools used to ensure timely repayments. Marco, with his inherent sense of fairness, sometimes felt a pang of unease when a borrower clearly struggled. He'd occasionally extend a grace period, a decision that didn't sit well with Isabella, who adhered strictly to the financial logic of their operation. "We're not running a charity, Marco," she'd remind him, her voice sharp. Easy money comes with hard rules. Ethical dilemmas began to surface in small, almost imperceptible ways. A borrower would plead for an extension, citing a family emergency. Another would offer a small gift, a trinket or meal, perhaps as a way to curry favor. These moments tested their moral compasses, forcing them to confront the human element within their transactional world. Javier, haunted by his own past financial struggles, often felt a surge of empathy, while Luis, still somewhat naive, struggled to reconcile the friendly faces with the underlying pressure of their business. Rafael, their supposed mentor, remained an enigma. He was generous with his initial guidance, showing them the ropes, introducing them to key contacts. But there were also moments of veiled secrecy, hushed phone calls conducted in private, and a network of associates they never quite met. He seemed to operate on a different level, hinting at connections and influences that went beyond the simple act of lending. Whispers of territorial agreements and the need to respect certain boundaries would occasionally slip from his lips, vague yet unsettling. One sweltering afternoon, while collecting from a cantina owner in a less touristy part of the city, Marco witnessed a brief but chilling exchange. A burly man with a menacing tattoo on his arm approached their borrower, his voice low and demanding. Rafael, who had accompanied Marco that day, intervened with a surprising display of authority, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by a steely resolve. The burly man backed down, but the air remained thick with unspoken threat. Later, when Marco questioned Rafael about the incident, his mentor simply smiled and said, "Just business, Marco. Some people need a little encouragement." As the weeks turned into months, the initial excitement began to wane, replaced by a growing sense of unease. The shadows of Cancun, initially glimpsed only at the periphery, seemed to be lengthening, encroaching upon their carefully constructed reality. The easy fortune they had sought felt increasingly intertwined with a world they didn't fully understand, a world where the rules seemed fluid and the consequences potentially severe. They were making money, yes, more than they ever had back in Colombia. But a nagging feeling persisted, a sense that they were walking a tightrope over an unseen abyss. And the drop-by-drop descent into this unfamiliar territory was just beginning to reveal its true, perilous nature. The subtle hints of coercion, the glimpses of a darker underbelly, the enigmatic figure of Rafael, all were pieces of a puzzle that promised a grim picture. What they didn't yet know was how deeply they were already entangled, and how difficult it would be to untangle themselves from the webs being spun around them, one small loan at a time. The seemingly simple act of lending, drop by drop, was leading them down a path where the price of easy money might be far higher than they could ever have imagined. The subtle unease that had begun to prick at their consciences soon sharpened into a tangible fear, a cold knot in the pit of their stomachs. The incident at the cantina, where Rafael had displayed that unsettling authority, lingered in Marco's mind. It was a stark contrast to the easygoing mentor persona he usually projected, hinting at a deeper, more dangerous network at play. Whispers, like the humid Cancun air, began to circulate, rumors of local gangs, of cartels who held sway over the informal lending systems, demanding their share, their pound of flesh. These weren't the whispers of tourists haggling over souvenirs, these were hushed warnings passed between borrowers, fearful glances exchanged in the crowded markets. One stifling evening, Javier, nursing a lukewarm beer in a dimly lit bar frequented by other Colombians, overheard a conversation that sent a shiver down his spine. Two men spoke in low, urgent tones about a lender who had forgotten his place, about a brutal beating and a van fire in the dead of night. The details were vague, shrouded in fear, but the implication was chillingly clear. There were forces at work in Cancun far more menacing than delinquent borrowers. He tried to dismiss it as drunken gossip, but the fear in the man's eyes felt undeniably real. The looming presence of these unseen powers began to manifest in more direct ways. Rafael, their once affable guide, became increasingly demanding. His tone grew sharper, his smile less frequent. He started mentioning contributions, a percentage of their earnings that needed to be passed along, a fee for operating within certain territories. When Isabella questioned the legitimacy of these demands, Rafael's eyes hardened. "This isn't Bogota," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Here, things work differently. There are those who facilitate our business, and they expect to be compensated for their services." It was Marco who first encountered El Martillo, the hammer. He was a hulking figure with a shaved head and eyes that seemed to hold no warmth, only a cold, calculating menace. Marco was collecting from a small grocery store owner when El Martillo strolled in, accompanied by two equally intimidating men. They didn't say a word, but their presence filled the small space with a palpable tension. El Martillo simply nodded curtly at the store owner, who visibly paled and quickly handed over a thick wad of cash, far more than Marco was expecting. As El Martillo and his crew turned to leave, his gaze lingered on Marco for a moment, a silent warning that spoke volumes. Marco recounted the encounter to the others, his voice tight with apprehension. Isabella, ever pragmatic, saw it as a cost of doing business, an unwelcome but perhaps unavoidable tax. Javier, however, was deeply disturbed. The image of El Martillo's cold eyes haunted him, a stark reminder of the dangers they had unknowingly stepped into. Even Luis, whose initial enthusiasm had begun to wane, felt a prickle of genuine fear. The easy money didn't seem so easy anymore, it felt tainted, earned under a shadow of threat. The pressure intensified with a specific incident that targeted Isabella. One morning, she found a crude drawing taped to the door of their shared apartment, a hammer dripping blood. The message was unmistakable. Paranoia began to creep into their lives. Every unfamiliar car that passed seemed suspicious, every phone call a potential threat. They started looking over their shoulders, their once carefree movements replaced by a nervous vigilance. Trust within the group also began to fray. Isabella suspected Rafael was deliberately downplaying the dangers, perhaps even complicit with these shadowy figures. Marco worried about Javier's increasingly withdrawn demeanor, while Luis, feeling trapped and out of his depth, began to resent Marco for painting such a rosy picture of Cancun. One particularly tense evening, Rafael summoned them to a dimly lit warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale beer and something else, something metallic and vaguely threatening. Several burly men, including El Martillo, were present. Rafael, his usual smile absent, laid out the new terms with brutal clarity. The contributions were increasing, and there were new rules about where they could and could not operate. He spoke of respecting territories and the consequences of disobedience, his gaze flicking pointedly towards El Martillo, who cracked his knuckles ominously. The meeting left them shaken. The illusion of independence, of being their own bosses, shattered completely. They were cogs in a much larger, more dangerous machine, their every move dictated by forces they couldn't see but could certainly feel. The easy money had come with a heavy price, a debt that was now being called due, not in pesos, but in fear and a growing sense of dread. The vibrant promise of Cancun had curdled into a suffocating reality, and the webs of influence that governed the new world were tightening around them, threatening to pull them under. The rising tensions within the group mirrored the escalating danger outside, a pressure cooker environment where one wrong move could have devastating consequences. And as they navigated this treacherous landscape, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were dancing on the edge of a precipice, with a long and terrifying fall waiting below. The question wasn't if they would fall, but when and how far. The tightening grip of the local underworld had left an undeniable mark on their operation, a constant pressure that squeezed the joy from their initial venture. The warehouse meeting, with El Martillo's silent threat hanging heavy in the air, served as a brutal wake-up call. They were no longer independent entrepreneurs chasing the promise of easy money. They were small players in a game with far more dangerous rules and far higher stakes. And the unraveling of their precarious situation began with a debt, a seemingly ordinary delinquency that would expose the rotten core of their newfound lives in Cancun. The borrower in question was named Javier, not one of their own, but a local businessman who ran a small but popular seafood restaurant near the tourist zone. He had initially taken a significant loan, a sum that represented a considerable portion of their collective earnings, with the promise of rapid repayment fueled by the high-season influx of tourists. For a while, he had kept his word, the daily drops diligently collected by Luis, who had developed a friendly, almost jovial relationship with the restaurateur. But as the weeks passed, Javier's payments became erratic, excuses replacing the crisp peso notes. First, it was a slow week, then a family illness, then a problem with suppliers. The sum owed ballooned, creating a significant debt in their cash flow and fueling Isabella's ever-present anxiety. Isabella, with her meticulous accounting, pressed for action. "We need to go see him, Marco," she insisted one sweltering afternoon, her voice tight with frustration. "This is too much money to let slide. Rafael won't be happy." Marco, despite his unease about direct confrontation, knew she was right. They couldn't afford to let this debt linger, not with the increasing demands from Rafael and the ominous presence of El Martillo looming over them. Javier, the other Javier, their quiet and observant compatriot, voiced his concerns. "Be careful," he cautioned. "I've heard things about this restaurant owner. He might have connections." But the urgency of their financial situation outweighed his warning. So, Marco and Isabella went to the restaurant. The once bustling establishment was surprisingly quiet, a few listless tourists picking at their meals. Javier, the borrower, greeted them with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. He offered more apologies, more vague promises of payment soon. But Isabella was having none of it. Her patience, already thin, snapped. "We've heard enough excuses, Javier," she said, her voice sharp and unwavering. "We need the money, and we need it now." The atmosphere in the restaurant shifted instantly. The forced pleasantries vanished, replaced by a palpable tension. Javier's eyes flickered nervously towards a couple of men sitting at a corner table, men with the same hard, unreadable expressions Marco had seen on El Martillo's associates. A cold dread washed over him. This wasn't just a simple debt collection, something else was at play. "Look, Javier," the borrower said, his voice now etched with a subtle defiance, "things aren't always straightforward here. I'm good for it, but you need to give me a little more time." "Time?" Isabella scoffed. "We've given you weeks. This isn't some game." It was at this point that Marco made a rash decision, a misjudgment fueled by a growing desperation and a desire to assert some control in their increasingly powerless situation. He remembered the shoes and sneakers Tatiana had taken from Brian's house in a previous collection, a crude but effective way of leveraging payment. "If you can't pay us in cash," Marco said, his voice hardening, "then we'll take something of value until you do." Before Isabella could object, Marco gestured towards a large, expensive-looking television mounted on the wall. "That will do for a start." Javier's face contorted in anger. "You can't just take my property." "We can, and we will," Marco retorted, his bravado masking his inner turmoil. "You owe us a lot of money." As Marco moved to detach the television, one of the men from the corner table stood up. He was tall and powerfully built, his eyes fixed on Marco with a chilling intensity. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, amigo." His voice was low and menacing, laced with a distinct local accent. The air crackled with threat. Marco froze, his hand hovering near the television mount. He suddenly understood. Javier wasn't just a delinquent borrower, he was connected. Connected to the very forces they were trying to navigate, the shadows that loomed over their easy money scheme. Isabella's face paled. She recognized the danger immediately. "Marco, let's just go," she urged, pulling at his arm. But the damage was done. The confrontation had escalated, a line had been crossed. Javier, emboldened by the presence of his associates, made a call on his cell phone, speaking rapidly in Spanish, a language Marco and Isabella only partially understood, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, accusatory. Within minutes, the flashing blue and red lights of police vehicles filled the street outside. Officers swarmed into the restaurant, their expressions grim. Marco and Isabella were quickly surrounded, their protests ignored. Javier, the borrower, pointed at them, his face a mask of righteous indignation. "These Colombians were trying to rob me," he declared. The feeling of being trapped was overwhelming, a suffocating wave of despair. Betrayal stung them, not just from Javier, but also from the system they had bought into, the promise of easy money that had led them into this nightmare. The local police, the very authorities they had hoped would provide some semblance of order, were now arresting them, seemingly siding with a local connected to the very criminal elements they feared. As they were led away in handcuffs, the vibrant colors of Cancun seemed to mock them, the paradise they had sought now a gilded cage. Javier, the quiet Colombian, watched them go, his face a mixture of pity and fear. He had warned them, but their desperation had blinded them. The catalyst for their arrest, a debt and a borrower's calculated betrayal, had set in motion a chain of events that would plunge them into a darkness far deeper than they could have ever imagined. The easy money had vanished, replaced by the cold reality of iron bars and the chilling uncertainty of what lay ahead. What they didn't know then was that this arrest was not the end, but merely the beginning of a far more terrifying ordeal, one that would test their loyalty, their resilience, and ultimately, their will to survive in a world where the lines between law and crime were dangerously blurred. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into their wrists, a stark contrast to the humid Cancun air they had hoped would usher in an era of easy money and a better life. As Marco and Isabella were bundled into the back of separate police cruisers, a chilling realization dawned. The betrayal wasn't just Javier's, it was a systemic rot, a cancer within the very institutions meant to protect them. The flashing lights outside the seafood restaurant painted the scene in stark, unforgiving hues, each pulse a beat of their dwindling hope. What awaited them at the station felt less like justice and more like a descent into an abyss. Inside the dimly lit precinct, the initial confusion and disbelief slowly morphed into a gnawing fear. Their attempts to explain the situation, their broken Spanish mixed with desperate pleas in English, were met with indifference, sometimes even a sneer. The arresting officers, their faces impassive, processed them with a bureaucratic detachment that was almost more terrifying than outright hostility. They were numbers now, Colombians caught in some minor infraction, easily disposable in the grand scheme of things in a city that swallowed dreams whole. Then, Lieutenant Vargas entered the picture. He was a man in his late 40s, his uniform crisp but slightly rumpled, his eyes holding a weariness that hinted at 1,000 compromises. He carried himself with an air of cynical authority, the kind that comes from navigating the murky underbelly of a world where the law is less a guiding principle and more a tool to be wielded. He spoke fluent English, his tone smooth, almost conversational, as he addressed Marco and Isabella. "So," he began, leaning against the metal desk, a thin smile playing on his lips. "Our little gota entrepreneurs have run into a bit of trouble, haven't they?" He already knew who they were, what they were doing. The casual way he used the term, the illegal lending system they had embraced as their ticket to a better life, sent a fresh wave of unease through them. "Officer, there's been a misunderstanding," Isabella pleaded, her voice trembling slightly. "The restaurant owner, Javier, he owes us money. We were just trying to—" Vargas cut her off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Trying to strong-arm a local businessman. That's how it looks, isn't it? And Javier here," he gestured towards the restaurateur, who stood smugly in the corner, flanked by the two men from his establishment, is a respected member of the community. The blatant lie hung heavy in the air. Respected by whom? Marco wondered, his mind racing. "But he's lying," Marco interjected, his voice rising in desperation. "He owes us a significant amount of money. We have records." Vargas chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Records? And an illegal lending operation? Those won't hold much weight here, amigo." He paused, his gaze sweeping over them, assessing their fear. Here's how things work in Cancun. There are certain agreements. Understand? They didn't understand, not fully. But a cold dread was creeping into their hearts, a sense of being caught in a web far more intricate and dangerous than they had ever imagined. The casual mention of agreements, the knowing look in Vargas's eyes, it all pointed to a deeper corruption, a pact with the devil that governed this supposed paradise. Then came the chilling moment of the handover. It wasn't a formal procedure, no paperwork signed, no official transfer of custody. Instead, under the cloak of a late Cancun night, Marco, Isabella, and the bewildered Javier, the other Colombian, who had been inexplicably swept up in the arrest, were led out of the precinct, not towards a holding cell, but towards a fleet of unmarked black SUVs idling in the shadows. Their protests were met with rough shoves and curt, hushed commands from officers who just hours ago had sworn to uphold the law. Lieutenant Vargas stood by, a silent orchestrator, his face illuminated by the streetlights, a picture of cold indifference. As they were forced into the vehicles, the realization hit them with the force of a physical blow. They were being handed over. Handed over to someone else. Someone who operated outside the flimsy pretense of law and order. Fear, raw and primal, gripped him. Marco's mind flashed back to El Martillo's menacing gaze, to the hushed whispers of cartel influence. Isabella's face was ashen, her eyes wide with terror. Javier, caught in this terrifying vortex, looked from Marco to Isabella, a silent question in his eyes. What have we gotten ourselves into? The drive was short but agonizingly slow, each passing minute amplifying their dread. They were taken to a secluded location on the outskirts of the city, a place where the vibrant tourist facade of Cancun melted away to reveal a darker, more sinister reality. The air here was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something vaguely metallic that made Marco's stomach churn. They were pulled from the vehicles, their hands still cuffed, and met by a group of men whose presence exuded menace. These were not police officers. Their clothes, their posture, the cold, calculating look in their eyes spoke of a different kind of authority, the kind that ruled through fear and violence. El Martillo was among them, his hulking figure casting a long shadow in the dim light. Lieutenant Vargas stood at the edge of the scene, a silent observer to this unholy transaction. A brief, almost imperceptible nod passed between him and El Martillo. The pact was sealed. The corrupt officer had delivered his payment, and the Colombians, along with the unfortunate Javier, were now in the hands of the cartel. The betrayal cut deep. They had placed a naive trust in the local authorities, believing that even if their business was illegal, they would still be afforded some basic level of protection. But that trust had been shattered, replaced by the horrifying understanding that those they should have been able to rely on had instead delivered them into the jaws of the very beast they had unknowingly been circling. As they were led away by El Martillo's men, their pleas fading into the night, the vibrant promise of Cancun felt like a cruel joke. The easy money had led them down a path paved with deception and ending in a terrifying unknown. What fate awaited them in the hands of the cartel? Would they be extorted? Forced to work for them? Or would they simply disappear, swallowed by the shadows that lurked beneath the glittering surface of this Caribbean paradise? The suspense was a suffocating weight, a question mark hanging over their lives, heavy with the stench of betrayal and the chilling certainty of impending doom. The hand of the law, meant to protect, had instead delivered them into a pact with the devil, and the consequences would be far more brutal than any debt they had tried to collect. What unfolded next would reveal the true cost of their ambition and the terrifying reach of the shadows that governed Cancun. The black SUVs sped away into the Cancun night, carrying Marco, Isabella, and the bewildered Javier towards an uncertain and terrifying fate. Back in the familiar, bustling streets of Medellin, Colombia, life continued its relentless rhythm, unaware of the seismic shift that had just occurred in the lives of Elena, Marco's mother, and Sofia, Isabella's younger sister. They had waved goodbye to their loved ones months ago, filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation as Marco and Isabella embarked on their venture in the distant Mexican paradise. The promise of easy money, of a better life carved out by their own hands, had painted a vibrant picture of young dreams taking flight. Elena, a woman whose strength had been forged in the crucible of raising a family in a country often marked by hardship, had initially harbored reservations. The allure of quick riches always carried a shadow of risk in her mind. Yet, she had also seen the burning ambition in Marco's eyes, the yearning for a life beyond their modest means. She had offered her blessings, albeit with a mother's unspoken anxieties clinging to her heart. Sophia, on the other hand, Isabella's vivacious and fiercely protective younger sister, had been swept up in the excitement. Isabella, always the adventurous one, was finally going to achieve the comfortable life she deserved. Sophia imagined postcard-perfect scenes, sun-drenched beaches, and a future brimming with possibilities. The early messages from Cancun had done little to quell Elena's unease, though they had reassured Sophia. Marco and Isabella spoke of the initial success of their gota operation, the small victories that seemed to validate their leap of faith. Cancun, in their early descriptions, was indeed a land of vibrant beauty, a stark contrast to the often gray reality of Medellin. But even amidst the tales of bustling markets and friendly locals, Elena had sensed a certain guardedness in Marco's tone, a subtle undercurrent that hinted at the hidden dangers lurking beneath the surface of paradise. Sophia, however, focused on the positive, envisioning Isabella finally free from financial worries, her laughter echoing across the miles. The first crack in this fragile facade of optimism appeared as a missed call, then another unanswered message. Elena, accustomed to Marco's regular updates, felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. Sophia initially dismissed it as a busy day, the demands of a burgeoning business keeping Isabella occupied. But as days stretched into a week with no word, a chilling silence descended upon their small Medellin apartment. The vibrant images they had conjured of Cancun began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of foreboding. Then came the call, a garbled message from a frantic Daniela, Alexander's girlfriend, her voice thick with fear and disbelief. The words tumbled out in broken Spanish, painting a horrifying picture of arrest, police betrayal, and a handover to a notorious cartel. Elena's world tilted on its axis. Marco, her strong, headstrong son, in the hands of criminals? Sophia's initial denial was fierce, a desperate refusal to accept the nightmare Daniela described. There had to be a mistake, a terrible misunderstanding. Isabella, her bright, capable sister, couldn't possibly be in such danger. But as Daniela's subsequent calls provided more chilling details, the lack of official custody, the ransom demands, denial gave way to a crushing wave of fear and desperation. Elena, her heart a leaden weight in her chest, felt years added to her age in an instant. Sophia, her youthful optimism shattered, found herself consumed by a gnawing anxiety, each waking moment a torturous replay of Daniela's frantic words. The families in Colombia found themselves adrift in a sea of uncertainty, their pleas for information to the local authorities met with bureaucratic indifference. The Colombian consulate in Mexico offered vague assurances but little concrete help. The distance, the language barrier, the sheer helplessness of their situation amplified their agony. They were thousands of miles away, their loved ones vanished into a foreign underworld, with no one to turn to for reliable information. The ransom demands brought a new layer of agonizing decisions. 50,000 Mexican pesos, a fortune in their Colombian reality, was demanded for the safe return of Marco, Isabella, and the others. Elena and Sophia, along with other family members, scrambled to gather the funds, pooling their meager savings, borrowing from relatives and friends, their hope clinging precariously to the promise of their safe return. It was a desperate gamble, a pact made with unseen, malevolent forces, fueled by a mother's unwavering love and a sister's fierce devotion. The first payment was made, a significant sacrifice that left them financially vulnerable but clinging to the belief that their nightmare was nearing its end. But the promised release never came. Instead, another demand followed, an even larger sum, each call from the supposed intermediaries a fresh stab of fear and frustration. The emotional toll was immense. Sleepless nights were filled with tearful prayers and whispered conversations, their small apartment transformed into a war room of despair and dwindling hope. Elena, her face etched with worry lines, found herself oscillating between fierce determination and utter despair. Sophia, her usual laughter silenced, became a whirlwind of frantic phone calls and desperate online searches, clinging to any shred of information, any glimmer of hope in the encroaching darkness. The initial promise of easy money had morphed into a terrifying reality of extortion and the chilling possibility of never seeing their loved ones again. The days turned into weeks, each one an eternity of agonizing uncertainty. The vibrant dreams of a better life in Cancun had dissolved into a horrifying nightmare, leaving behind echoes of despair that resonated across continents, a testament to the devastating consequences of chasing shadows in a land where paradise masked hidden dangers. The families in Colombia, bound by love and fear, could only wait, their unwavering hope battling against the mounting despair, their ordeal a stark reminder of the human cost of deception and the torturous reach of the criminal underworld. What they didn't know was that their agony was far from over, and the echoes of despair would soon be joined by the shattering sound of irreversible loss. The agonizing wait stretched on, each unanswered phone call and each passing day chipping away at their fragile hope, leaving Elena and Sofia teetering on the precipice of utter devastation. The vibrant promise of Cancun now felt like a cruel phantom, a stark contrast to the chilling reality that had engulfed their loved ones. The path ahead remained shrouded in a terrifying uncertainty, the echoes of despair their constant companions. The echoes of despair that clung to the Medellin apartment were soon to be amplified by a chilling discovery in distant Cancun. Days bled into weeks after Marco, Isabella, and Javier vanished into the clutches of the cartel. Elena and Sofia lived in a torturous limbo, the ransom payments having yielded nothing but further demands and a gnawing sense of dread. The vibrant promise of easy money and a better life, the young dreams that had propelled their loved ones across borders, now seemed like a cruel mirage, swallowed by the shadows that permeated the supposed paradise. Then came the news reports, initially vague and unsettling, filtering through the Colombian media. A dismembered body had been found on the outskirts of Cancun, near Nichupté Avenue, a place now whispered about in hushed tones. The details were gruesome, deliberately vague, mentioning black bags and a chilling lack of immediate identification. For Elena and Sofia, each fragmented piece of information was like a shard of glass piercing their already wounded hearts. Was it Marco? Was it Isabella? Or perhaps the unfortunate Javier, caught in their ill-fated venture? The agonizing wait for confirmation began, a period of torturous uncertainty where hope and fear battled for dominance with each passing hour. The news painted a horrifying picture of brutality, a stark illustration of the ruthless violence that lurked beneath Cancun's tourist veneer. The description of the scene, the clandestine discovery, the lack of witnesses, the sheer disregard for human life, sent a fresh wave of terror crashing over the families in Colombia. Elena found herself unable to eat, the image of her son, vibrant and full of life, possibly reduced to such a state, a constant, sickening presence in her mind. Sofia, usually so resilient, retreated into a shell of fear, her phone clutched tightly in her hand, desperately hoping for a call that would dispel the growing darkness. The local authorities in Cancun offered little solace, their statements evasive and unhelpful. The lack of transparency only fueled the family's suspicion and distrust. How could someone simply disappear after being taken into police custody? The question haunted their every waking moment, a stark testament to the deep-seated corruption they now knew existed. The possibility that the dismembered body belonged to one of their own grew with each passing day of official silence. Social media, a double-edged sword in times of crisis, became both a source of fleeting hope and profound anxiety. Rumors and unconfirmed reports swirled, each one a potential harbinger of devastating news. The families clung to any detail, any suggestion that their loved ones might still be alive, while simultaneously dreading the moment the vague reports would solidify into a concrete, irreversible tragedy. The vibrant hues of Cancun's beaches and resorts, once symbols of hope, were now stained with the grim reality of cartel violence and the chilling anonymity of death. The avenue where the body was found became, in their minds, an avenue of lost souls, a testament to the brutal end of young dreams lured by the deceptive promise of easy money. The glimmer of horror had begun to illuminate the true cost of their venture, casting a long, dark shadow over the lives of those who remained behind, waiting and fearing the inevitable confirmation of their deepest fears. The idyllic image of a Caribbean paradise had shattered, replaced by the stark and brutal reality of a land where shadows reigned and young lives could be extinguished with chilling impunity. The families braced themselves, unknowingly standing at the precipice of a devastating truth that would forever alter the course of their lives. The glimmer of horror that had illuminated Nichupté Avenue soon solidified into a devastating truth for Elena. The dismembered body, the one found shrouded in black bags, was indeed her Marco. The confirmation arrived not through official channels, but through a leaked photograph, a gruesome image that ripped through her soul, leaving an unfillable void. Her initial shock gave way to a raw, inconsolable grief, a mother's primal scream silenced only by the crushing weight of reality. For Sophia, the news was like a physical blow, the vibrant memories of her adventurous sister Isabella now tainted by a chilling uncertainty. If Marco, the seemingly more cautious one, had met such a brutal end, what fate awaited Isabella and Javier? The hope that had flickered against the darkness began to dwindle, replaced by a gnawing fear that they too had been swallowed by the shadows of Cancun. The lack of cooperation from the Mexican authorities only deepened their despair and fueled a bitter sense of injustice. Their pleas for information were met with bureaucratic indifference, their questions deflected with vague excuses about faulty security cameras and inaccessible records. The very people who should have been their allies in this nightmare seemed complicit, their silence speaking volumes about the corruption that permeated the system. How could police officers arrest their loved ones only to hand them over to a notorious cartel? The question echoed in the stunned silence of their Medellin apartment, a constant reminder of their helplessness. In a cruel twist, news of arrests did eventually surface. Some individuals were apprehended, including a few local police officers implicated in the very handover that had sealed Marco's fate. Yet, these arrests brought little comfort and even less information about Isabella, Javier, and now Luis, another young Colombian who had become entangled in the same dangerous web. The authorities offered no concrete answers about their whereabouts, their silence prolonging the agonizing uncertainty for their families back in Colombia. Elena, her face etched with grief and exhaustion, found herself trapped in a recurring nightmare, Marco's smiling face dissolving into the horrific image from the leaked photograph. Sophia, though outwardly stoic, carried the weight of her sister's unknown fate, each day a torturous cycle of hope and despair. The promise of easy money, the allure of a better life in the sun-drenched paradise of Cancun, had led them down a path paved with deception and ending in unimaginable brutality. The long shadow of doubt stretched across continents, a constant reminder of the unanswered questions and the profound injustice they had suffered. The fight for truth and the desperate search for Isabella, Javier, and Luis continued, fueled by a love that refused to be extinguished by distance or despair, even as the odds seemed stacked against them. The young dreams that had once shone so brightly were now lost in the darkness, leaving behind only the bitter taste of betrayal and the haunting echo of what might have been.